This video is not intended for anyone under the age of 13.
Hey everyone, it's Matt here, and welcome back to another episode of Commander Adventures. This is the week we have the game featuring Devin's new favorite commander. So let's not waste any time, and jump straight into introductions. First off we have Devin, playing Greven Predator Captain. As one last note, we actually don't have opening hands for this week. Next up we have Brian, playing Brudiclad Telchor Engineer. Then comes Juan, playing Torbran, Thane of Red Fell. And finally we have Juan, playing Breya Etherium Shaper. Devin starts us off. He drops a swamp, and passes turn. Brian drops an island, and uses it to cast a soul ring, before passing as well. Juan drops a mountain, and then Juan closes out round 1 with a tapped Grand Colosseum. Devin draws. He drops a Bloodstained Mire, and misses the damage to crack it. He shocks in a Blood Crypt, before casting a Generator Servant, and passing turn. Brian casts a Windfall, and as everyone wheels, we'll be right back. So there's actually not a bit this week, you guys. Instead, I'm going to ask you to leave feedback in the comments, or the poll I posted here, on whether or not you like the new overlay. I wanted to do something more minimalistic, which leaves room for cards appearing and the stack, while still showing more than enough relevant information. Let me know what you think, because I'm more than glad to hear from you all. Brian then misses a land drop, despite having a new hand of 7, and passes turn. Juan drops another mountain. He casts a Grenzo Havoc Razor, and passes as well. Juan drops a Spire of Industry. He pings himself to cast an Etherium Sculptor, and then free casts a Skull Clamp with its cost reduction. Devin untaps. He drops a City of Brass, and follows it up with a Mana Crypt. He then cracks Generator Servant for 2 colorless mana, and uses that mana to help pay for Greven with haste. He then misses the damage from City of Brass to cast a Plunge into Darkness. As it resolves, he pays in a total of 15 life, making Greven a 21/5. He then looks at the top 15 cards of his library, puts 1 to hand, and exiles the rest. He moves to combat, and swings 21 at Juan, who's completely run over, for lethal commander damage. Brian drops a mountain, and then casts a Felwar Stone. He then passes to Juan. Juan untaps. He drops a mountain as well, and then misses the damage from Spire of Industry to cast a Demonic Tutor. He goes to grab a card, and then free casts the Mana Vault he tutored up. He uses it to cast a Talisman of Dominance, and then shocks himself to cast a Reshape, where X is 2, sacrificing Mana Vault as part of the cost. He grabs an Expedition map to the battlefield, and passes turn. Devin untaps. He fails his Mana Crypt flip on his upkeep, and then loses 3 life as Greven gets pumped by 3. He then casts his own Demonic Tutor. He grabs a card, and then pings himself to cast the Wall of Blood he tutored up. In response, Brian counterspells it. Devin moves to combat, and hits Brian for 9 before passing turn. Brian untaps. He drops a Reliquary Tower, and then casts the Siege Gang Commander. He creates 3 1/1 goblins as it enters, and then passes turn. Juan untaps. In main 1, he casts a Goblin Welder. He then cracks his Expedition map to go and grab a Glacial Chasm, which he plays for turn. He remembers to sacrifice Spire of Industry to its ETB before passing off. Devin untaps. He then takes 3 from Mana Crypt on his upkeep. He casts the Thran Dynamo, which he then uses to cast a Varrock Battle Horns. He pays to equip them to Greven, and then passes off. Brian untaps. He casts a Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards, and then putting 2 cards back on the top of his library. He then drops a Command Tower, before passing turn. Juan untaps. On his upkeep, he puts an age counter onto Glacial Chasm, and then pays 2 life to keep it. In his main 1, he activates Goblin Welder, and uses it to exchange his Skull Clamp on board with the Mana Vault in his graveyard. He then pings himself for a blue from Talisman of Dominance to cast a Fabricate. He grabs a Thornbite Staff to hand, and then uses his floating mana to cast it. Finally, he closes out his turn with a Palladium Mirror. Devin untaps. On his upkeep, he succeeds his Mana Crypt flip, and avoids damage. He casts a Lightning Greaves, and equips them to Greven. He follows up with a Lupine Prototype, and then casts Chainer Nightmare Adept, pinging himself with City of Brass in the process. He moves to combat, and swings Greven at Brian. On attack, he sacrifices Lupine Prototype to Greven, loses 5 life, draws 5 cards, and pumps Greven by 5 more. When priority passes on Declaration of Attackers again, Brian casts an Aetherize, bouncing Greven back to Devin's hand. In main 2, Devin moves to equip Chainer with the Greaves, and in response, Brian shocks Chainer with Siege Gang Commander. Out of options at this point, Devin discards down and passes. Brian untaps. He drops a Shivan Reef, and then casts his commander Brudiclad. He follows up with a Lightning Greaves, and then equips them to Brudiclad before moving to combat. He creates a 2/1 blue mirror at the beginning of combat, and then makes all of his tokens copies of that mirror. He then closes out his turn by swinging lethal at Devin. Juan untaps. On his upkeep, Glacial Chasm gets another counter, and he then pays 4 life to keep it. He then elects to not pay to untap Mana Vault, and takes the damage after his draw. In main 1, he taps Goblin Welder to exchange his Etherium Sculptor on board with the Ashnod's Altar in his graveyard. He then taps and sacks Palladium Mirror for a total of 4 colorless mana, which he uses to equip Thornbite Staff to Goblin Welder. He follows that up with a Goblin Engineer, and puts a Mirror Battlesphere into his graveyard with its ETB. He sacrifices the Engineer to Ashnod's for 2 colorless mana, and its death untaps Goblin Welder. He then uses the Welder to exchange his Mana Vault on board with the Mirror Battlesphere in his graveyard, which makes 4 1/1 Mirror tokens as it enters. He then sacrifices the Battlesphere to Ashnod's, adding 2 more colorless mana and untapping Goblin Welder in the process. He can now repeatedly use Goblin Welder to exchange a token on board with Mirror Battlesphere to create Infinite Mirror. With a ton of Mirror in play from the previous part of the combo, Juan can now sacrifice one of them to Ashnod's to generate 2 colorless mana. As the token dies, a trigger to untap Goblin Welder will be put on the stack, and Juan can use the colorless mana to activate the pinging ability of Thornbite Staff, tapping Goblin Welder in the process. The damage resolves through, and then Goblin Welder resets, allowing Juan to ping Brian for lethal, and walk away with a win. I want to thank all the players for being a part of this game, and to give a shout out to Dungeon Games for allowing us to film. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and a comment, and make sure to subscribe, and ring the bell to see more of our Commander content. I know I say it every week, but it really does make a huge difference for us. Also, a few people have asked how they can support us outside of just subscribing. So we went ahead and set up a Patreon. We'll have a video soon talking more about it, and the channel as a whole. But for now, the corrected link is in the description. I'll see you all next Saturday, with a game with a really unconventional ending. And as always, thank you all for watching.